Welcome back and thanks for tuning in. I'm Nick, and this is Super Simple Security Principles, where we talk about digital security principles that are easy to understand no matter your skill level. We are part of the I Hate Passwords Digital Self Defense Academy, or IHP Academy for short. Okay, so today's episode is episode number 29. It is a listener question episode. Am I safer using Apple devices? As always, joining me today, our Master Guardian, Makane. How you doing,
Nick,
bud?
doing good.
Yes. So let's get into this. This is a question. This is a question that honestly Matt asked me, and it's a fair question because it's a question that I honestly tend to believe, even though I don't know the answer. So luckily, you're going to answer this question for us today. But it's a question that I also ask myself. I think I'm safer using Apple device. So therefore, maybe I let my security down a little bit. I don't know. You're going to help us out again today. So, Makani, am I safer using Apple devices?
Well, it's interesting. You just alluded to one of the things I was thinking about. I didn't end up actually keeping in my notes to talk about, but is this notion that if we do feel safer, does that mean we let our guard down, right? Just because we're like, oh, we've got an Apple device, we're safe, we're good. So, do we slack then, right? So that's an interesting thing to think about because we don't want to do that, right?
Right.
Regardless really of how safe or not we are, how much security the device itself conveys. So, but well, and I'll say this too. I'm grateful for the question from Matt because it is a question that I've gotten a few times over the years, and in the moment I haven't had a lot of time to really think about it, right? So I've given answers, but this gave me time to really dive deep into what it is, and it turned out to be really long. And so I ended up splitting it up into two episodes, which I mean, I know you're smiling, right? Like you're not surprised by this, right?
Not at all. Not at all.
And nobody who knows me is probably surprised by answers, especially when it comes to online security, tend to be long. But so the way I divide it, though, is today we're going to talk about Apple versus Android. And then in episode 34, we'll talk about Apple versus Windows. And I want to say, too, I guess I just want to thank Matt again for the question because not only gave me an excuse to think about it, because asking the right questions is one of the keys to staying safe online. And here's how I'll start my answer. What device you pick is significant, but just know that the device you choose is only one layer in your security. And this is something I know, Nick, that from the first time we talked about layers has really stuck with you.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
right, if you neglect the other layers, right, your device isn't going to keep you safe by itself.
Right. Right. Okay, this is making sense. So this is why this episode's important. Here's one layer of our protection. We're going to layer
Yeah.
up. Okay.
And we're going to analyze, right? We care about the quality and strength of this layer, of your device layer, but
Yeah.
we also want to remind ourselves that putting all of the right layers in place is just as important.
Right.
And one of the ways that I've heard a podcaster talking about it, not in the context of online security, but I kind of stole it because I love the idea, is that we're striving for the Goldilocks zone, right? Not
Yeah.
not too hot, not too cold, just right. So we don't want to overemphasize the importance of your choice of device, but we also don't want to undervalue it.
Perfect.
Okay, so then I realized even breaking it up by device wasn't quite enough to get it short. Yeah, the more I got into it. So we're going to narrow it even a little bit further. And the way we're going to do that is by adding a clarifying question. And that is, we're going to say, what are we safe from?
Okay.
Okay, we're on what devices, but what threat are we answering? Are we comparing? And there could be many answers to that, but the one that I feel like is the most significant and one I want to focus on today, at least, is malware.
Okay.
So then if we put our two restrictions together, we can kind of reframe our question. Yeah. Well, I know I'm going to talk about malware but go ahead.
That was my question.
Yeah. No, we're
What is?
absolutely, we're on the same page. That's going to be my next thing. So
Perfect.
appreciate you keeping me on task with that. But I just wanted to put those together so that our new question that we're answering is, am I safer from malware using an iPhone compared to an Android phone?
Dude, I love this. This is setting us up for a lot of episodes in the future.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully, and you can tell me, does that sound like a question though that would stay true to what Matt's hoping to learn?
It's assuming your definition of malware is what I'm thinking it's going to be.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, maybe I'll say this. I'll answer that as soon as I can answer the question, what is malware?
Sold. Sounds good. Okay, so it's pretty simple. The mal part of the malware is just short for malicious. So it's malicious software. In other words, software that hurts you instead of helps you, typically stealing from you. There are multiple things it does, but mostly it likes to steal your data, get into your account, steal your money, and whatever it can. So there's a few other
That's
aspects of
mal.
malware I'll talk
Okay.
about, but right, does that
Malicious.
make sense so far?
Yep. Malicious makes sense. Yep.
Okay. So now diving in just a little bit more about malware, some malware you actually install yourself without realizing it. Okay. This is malware that masquerades as innocent software. Yeah.
May have done this the other day with my mother-in-law. Helping install like software, I think, for a
Uh-huh.
printer that she had never used before. So we went online and searched, kept wanting her information, credit card stuff, da 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 da. But what leads me to believe that it was wrong is that eventually, once we went to the printer and got the exact printer name and number and what it was, we were able to find the right software stuff and download it and actually print with it. But that
Yeah.
first one was not.
Well, and if it's asking for a credit card, your printer, the software for your printer, it's called a printer driver, and it's never going to cost money or ask for a credit card number. So that's definitely a big red flag.
I'm going to have her
Yeah,
ask the question how to delete that malware that she may have downloaded in future episodes. How does that sound?
that sounds great. Yep.
I'll apologize now.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me.
Yep. So this malware that looks innocent, it could be an app. So on a phone, it's mostly going to be an app or like a mini app that gets added on to some other app, like a browser extension, which we'll
Okay.
talk about more. I know we haven't really talked about that. We're going to have all of episode 31 where we'll talk about browser extensions. But one that might be more familiar is like a custom emoji keyboard, for example. Again, you
Mm,
get through the app store,
yep.
and
Yep.
on the surface, right, those things are doing something helpful, or at least at the very least pretending to do something helpful, but behind the scenes, it's working against you. And then there's another category of malware that you don't voluntarily install, but it sneaks its way onto your device without realizing it. And of course, it doesn't have to pretend to be helpful because it's there without you knowing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then the last thing about malware is, regardless of how it gets onto your device, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, it has the same objective, right? It wants to get access to as much of your data as possible. Some of them, it's less common, but they could try to turn on your microphone and record you, or your camera and watch you. And all of them, well, not all of them, but most of them try to stay invisible for as long as possible so they can just keep doing damage.
That kind of stinks.
Yeah, right. Exactly. They don't announce themselves and say, "Here I am doing damage." There are signs sometimes, but yeah. So how's that? We good on anything? You have any that bring up any other questions about malware before we start comparing?
No, I think that's a good base, right? Malware, something that's going to be, it's malicious. It's something that we inadvertently or on purpose add to our phones or our devices.
Yep.
And so we're just trying to avoid it. So let's find out which device does a better job of avoiding it, shall we?
Well, and what you're thinking about it there made me remember is the more familiar term that most people would think of is a virus, right? Like this is a
Okay.
very familiar, I got a computer virus, right?
Okay.
Now, from technically speaking, a virus is one particular kind of malware, but it in a lot of ways it's used synonymously with virus for a lot of people. That's the idea. I don't want to get a computer virus. I don't want to get infected. It's just the
Right.
idea. So, okay, so we talked about the two different ways, and you just mentioned again, we get malware, right? And that's where we can really start comparing Apple to Android.
Okay.
So we'll talk about the first way, where you knowingly install the software, obviously without realizing it's malware. And on a phone, since that's where we're focusing for today, that means your app store.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, how do the app stores compare between Apple and Android?
Yeah.
With Apple, you have exactly one app store option, the one that's run by Apple, and it's locked down tight. Apple has many restrictions, and it's a slow, very strict approval process. In contrast, Android they do have a main app store, the Google Play Store. Anybody who uses Android will be familiar with it. But there are many competing app stores as well. And as I was researching, I found one article that talked about just the top 11 best app stores. So apparently there are a lot of them.
Holy cow.
And on some phones, there are some of these other app stores are set up by default. Like the one I've seen in helping people most is the Galaxy Store. If you buy a Galaxy device from Samsung, which is one of the more popular Android brands. So Apple's controlling, dare I say, bossy approach gets a lot of
Yeah.
complaints and criticism. And I understand why, because Google and these other app stores, they give the makers of this software, maker of apps, much more freedom to experiment, and the approval process is quicker and easier. And there are some really great things about that freedom. But there are also some downsides. It means that way more malware apps make it into the various Android app stores than the single Apple one. And I really wanted to share exact numbers on that, but I just couldn't nail down those numbers anywhere and really be confident it was correct. But it was clear that the numbers were massively in favor of the Apple App Store containing fewer malware apps. Nobody that I found really disputed that fact.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So Apple is slower, a little more rigid. Sounds
Yep.
like a lot more potentially rigid.
Yeah.
But in doing so, it seems like I dare say if that's their goal and objective, is it working?
Right. Exactly. So, well, and here's the other factor that is very significant here is just the sheer number of Android devices. And these are ones that I was able to find stats on because as of now, there are more devices that are Android than any other kind of device, and by a pretty huge margin. So there's just two numbers I'll share, and these are
Okay.
both pulled from June of this year. If you're looking at just phones, Android has over 70% of the market. Now
Wow.
this is globally, right? This is globally, not in the
Okay.
US. The US only the numbers look very different. iPhone has a much higher percentage. But there are countries where Android has like 90+%. So, but even if you factor then in all devices, not just phones, but laptops and such, Android still wins at nearly 45%, with the next closest being Windows at 27%.
Hmm.
Right? So the relevance of this is kind of obvious, right? The hackers are just, they're aiming at the largest crowd.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And yeah, while that's not, it's not like, oh, it doesn't mean that Apple has really great security, right? It just means there's less people attacking them. So, that
There's
does
that.
give some level of safety anyway, even if,
Yeah.
Apple's not to credit for it, right?
Right.
So the conclusion on this point is that Apple wins. It's easier to avoid accidentally installing a malware app on an Apple device.
Right. Here's the funny thing, and this is going back to my mother-in-law's story, real quick, if I may.
Yeah.
She was using an Android device, like, and you know me, I'm an Apple user, and so I wasn't very familiar with it. And the fact that she had to, you know, do a little bit more searching than I would have had to have done led to potential problems. Not potential, led to problems. Period. So, yeah, kind of fascinating, especially knowing that there's so many different app stores available for these Android devices. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and that comes to the last part I want to talk about before we talk about the sneaky malware that and that is the advice, right? So this isn't the main focus of today's episode, but I figure I'd throw in quickly. If you use Android, the main advice I would give is stick to the main Google Play app store for your apps. Even then, I would suggest caution. For example, don't install apps that have been recently released to the App Store unless you absolutely know and trust the maker of that app. And we'll cover this more in a future episode, but in the meantime, as always, if you have a question about a specific app, be happy to take a look and help you research and decide if it's safe.
Yeah.
And for Apple users, my advice is even simpler. I would just say, please don't jailbreak your phone. It's a terrible idea for so many reasons. And if you have no idea what jailbreaking means, that's even better. Don't worry about it. You don't need to. You can forget about it. So I know I saw the look. It's like, you don't need to, but sometimes when people are searching for things, they'll see answers on the internet that talk about jailbreaking your iPhone. And it's not something you can accidentally do. You'd have to be extremely intentional about it, but it breaks your warranty and all sorts of things. It's just a bad idea. So,
Fair enough. We'll leave it at that. I've never had my phone jailbroken.
yeah,
So I'm going to not worry about it and not plan on doing it.
exactly. Okay, so let's talk about the second way your device can get infected by malware, when the malware sneaks past your defenses and installs itself without you even knowing it. And the two questions I want to answer here is first, how does this happen? Because that's relevant for answering the second one, which is, again, how well do Apple and Android protect you against this type of malware infection?
Yeah.
So, how it happens. from a technical perspective, there's a lot of different ways. And you might hear the words vulnerability or exploit or 0-day. Really, though, for most people, I'd sum it up in just one word: bugs. Your device is intended, of course, to be 100% safe from this type of silent malware infection, even though the reality is still far from that. That's the goal. So anytime a security hole of any kind is found, I call that a bug.
Okay.
And so then one of the questions is, how many of these are found? How many of these kind of bugs are found in Apple compared to Android? And this
Right.
one was hard to compare, hard to find the exact numbers, because not only is it not just a question of a simple count of bugs, but how impactful is each bug, because not all bugs are of equal
Created
significance.
equal.
Yeah, exactly. So even ones that let in or could be exploited in the same way. Anyway, it's kind of fuzzy, and it's also something that's varied from year to year. And anyway, my conclusion there is there's no clear winner if you're just talking about comparing bug count and weight.
Okay. So when it comes to bugs, they're about the same.
Well, bug count specifically,
Bug
right?
counts.
So the
Right.
second half of it, of this part, the second half of the half, whatever, is how quickly do the bugs get fixed? We don't even worry about the half.
Okay.
We'll just the
Yeah.
question,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Let's hear about this.
Because that's a critical question, because every moment between the time the bug is discovered and the public and the hackers know about it and the time that that fix actually gets to your device to keep you safe and that bug is gone is
Yeah.
time that the hackers can take advantage of it. So the speed of that fix matters a lot. And it's something that Google themselves, as makers of Android, is very well aware of, and they don't argue that they're a winner here. They know Apple's ecosystem gets bugs out faster, and it's something that they are actively working on improving. And I'm hopeful that they'll be able to make some good progress, and I hope they do. I sincerely do. I think it'd be good for everybody. But for now, because Apple controls both the hardware and software, they're able to get it out faster. And there's, once again, we have two things I'm going to break down here. Got a lot of twos in this
Okay.
section.
So they're faster to get their bugs fixed.
Yeah, and there's two reasons why they're faster,
Okay.
right? They're both connected to the fact that Apple is the maker of both the hardware and the software. Whereas in the case of Android, Google is the maker of the Android software, but there are a million different hardware manufacturers that install Android on their phones to distribute.
Ah,
There's a division of
okay.
labor there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. There's a whole bunch of different brands, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And Google's even got their own phone.
Yep, exactly. Right. Google is one of those hardware manufacturers, so you can get a
Right.
Google phone that has Google software and hardware like Apple. And in a lot of ways, that is your best bet to mitigate all these things I'm talking about, right? Because then it is much closer to the Apple model here. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
And so, go ahead.
No,
Did you?
you
Okay.
nailed it. You nailed it. Like that was my question. Okay, so if you were to try and say, "Hey, look, I'm still staying with an Android device," your best bet is to go with Google and go with
Right.
Google.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Good. That's a good thinking, because yeah, I didn't actually have to point that out specifically, but it's a very important point. So the first aspect is the responsibility, and Google actually has a blog post on their security blog where they talk about this, where they're talking about why this is part of the problem, is because sometimes the bug can be related to the hardware, not the software, but that's not
Mm,
always obvious right to begin with. So sometimes, like, they get a bug report and they're like, yeah, we can't fix that bug. We've got to kick that back to the hardware manufacturer. And they're like, oh, okay, all right, we'll fix that. But each of those steps adds time to it.
time. Right. And because Apple is the manufacturer of their hardware and their software, when they reach out to the hardware versus it being some other company. It's their own internal company. They're saying, hey, wait, you got to fix the hardware. There sounds like they're just a little more prone to get there. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, there's no question ever, right, about who's supposed to fix it.
Okay.
You know, it's very straightforward.
Okay, perfect.
So that's one aspect. But the second part is the distribution of the bug fix, because, and again, this is connected to the hardware and software, because Apple is very pushy in getting all of their devices updated, and it can be
Yeah.
pushy because it controls all the devices. But Google doesn't have that luxury except for the actual Google hardware. And so it's up to each phone manufacturer to decide when to pull in the fixes from Google, and their speed at doing that varies a lot. They have even a name for it on the internet you can search, called Android fragmentation, I think, because it's just
Really?
fragmented, it's split up. Yeah, because there's so many times. Like if you could pull statistics on, for example, what the version distribution of, if you look at all iPhones, what percentage are on the very latest version of iOS, the
Yeah.
operating system, it's very, very high. But on Android, it's much, much, much more distributed, especially
Really?
on the lower end phones and hardware. They may not for a very long time in some cases.
Huh.
So they may not get those security patches for a long time. Like it's all over. It's just, there's no central control. There's no central pushiness. It just really depends on the phone manufacturer. And so that speed goes back to, again, that gives the hackers more time. And therefore, overall, as a system, the Android, an Android device is going to be more prone to this kind of attack. But
Mm.
like you said, there is a lot you can do about that by picking a good hardware manufacturer. And, Google is certainly a good candidate as far as that goes, simply because then they're in control of both.
Excellent.
So the other thing, though, that you can do both for Android and Apple, and I highly recommend, the main way that as users we can try to prevent this kind of malware infection where they sneakily get onto our device is installing security updates in a timely fashion.
Okay.
And the good news is, in the last few years, Apple has now added it, and all the major platforms that I checked, Apple, Mac OS, Windows, Android, all now have a distinction between security updates and feature updates. Because lots of people do not want to jump on the latest feature bandwagon update, and
Right.
I totally appreciate why. And but now you don't have to. Like, you can just say automatically download and install security updates only, and let me check to see when I want to upgrade my features.
Gotcha.
And so, and there's, from my perspective, absolutely no reason to not automatically download and install security updates all the time. That is the best way to stay safe from this kind of thing. And it's one of the most ubiquitous security advice you will find on the internet when you're looking, because, and in this case, it's actually really, really good advice. That is one of the foundations for keeping safe online, is keeping your security updates installed on all your devices.
Okay, so that's non-techie advice. Here you go from Nick. Keep your stuff updated as far as your, you know, privacy and protection goes. Your security. You can leave all the frills and all the fancy bells and whistles for later, but for your security, get it updated immediately. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm actually, I created a post on the forum where they can go get instructions. It's fairly simple. It's mostly just a matter of going into your settings or preferences on your different device, and configuring the updates. But I put a little bit of information in there to help make that clear. So
Excellent. Excellent. That'll be a link I'll be taking, actually.
yeah,
Yeah. Does that
Okay.
surprise you?
No, no. Well, a little bit because I know we've looked at. Yeah, I mean, I know you've got Apple devices in it, so but yeah, probably shouldn't.
All right, what do
Okay,
you got for us?
so I'm ready to. That's the kind of the overall conclusion is that Apple kind of wins overall, really, at least as
Yeah.
far as malware goes. I don't see the gap though as so big that I'm running around telling everyone that they need to ditch Android and switch to
Okay.
Apple. Especially because, like we've talked about, there are a lot of ways to mitigate the impact of those differences. And the really good news to me is that both Apple and Google continue to increase their security in a significant way. And there's nowhere I'm more happy about having competition. Like I hope they both continue to thrive and improve their security.
Yeah, absolutely. We all want that. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I want to add at this point too, as we're wrapping up, that I am an iPhone user. I have never used an Android phone in my daily life. I do have several Android devices I own for testing and research, and I've helped plenty of people who use an Android device. But I just want to acknowledge that my personal experience, it colors how I see things. There's no avoiding that. I've tried to answer, objectively and as fairly as I can, but I'm happy to hear any, disputes or questions or, debates. Talk about it. And I'll just add one other thing on this front is honestly for me, and we'll talk about it more in a future day, but there are many reasons I use Apple rather than Android.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest that we haven't talked at all about today is trust in the company that makes the hardware and software. Like, how safe do I feel from threats, not from the hackers, right? But from the makers.
Hmm.
How much do I feel
Yeah.
there's a threat from Apple? How much do I feel there's a threat to me from Google, right?
Yeah.
And for me, Apple, I feel a lot less threat from, and most of that's related to more privacy concerns, which is an area of security with a lot more nuance and opinions than just staying safe from hackers, which is why that's just a much bigger topic for another day. But I just wanted to throw that in that's part of my reason because I know people are always asking like, what do you use? Because that says a lot, right? Like, what are my
Yeah.
personal choices?
Right.
And I want to be
Absolutely.
objective and fair, but I'm perfectly willing to share what my choices are.
Right. Which we appreciate. So, do you
So,
have a call to
any
action?
yeah, I was gonna say I wasn't sure if there was anything else. Sounds like you don't.
I,
So yeah, well,
I was gonna say it sounds pretty straightforward. If I were to ever go with Android, I have used Android products in the past before I started using Apple. Um, I came to Apple for a whole different set of ball wax, which I prefer Apple now over Android. Um, but that said, if I were to ever go Android, I would go with Google and probably use their stuff straight across the board. Try and keep it as tight knit as possible. So what's our call to action going to be?
yeah. Well, as you might imagine, this is a little bit of a tricky one, right? Because I'm not going to call for anybody to ditch Android. That's not
Right.
my call to action. There's too many non-security costs related to switching, if nothing else. You may not even have the option of switching for whatever reason. So I would just say use this as a reminder to focus on the things that you can control and that take action on whatever the one next most important step is in protecting yourself. Now, I know you may not know what that is. If you don't, I'd love to help you figure that out. Hopefully, if you're a long-time listener, you have a lot of options, a lot of ideas about what might be a good next step because we do a call to action every time. And then I'll just also add for all our listeners, but especially Matt, If this brings up any follow-up questions for you, please let us know. And as I mentioned earlier, next time in episode 34, we will talk about Apple versus Windows. I'm excited to talk about that too.
Okay, that's our super simple show today. If you're not a member of the IHP Academy already, please come join us for free. Stop searching the whole internet for answers and never knowing who to trust. Ask us instead. We made it super simple to find us, and it only takes 2 minutes to sign up. Just visit helpmegetsafe.com. Enter your name and your email. You're in. You can also find the link in our show notes. Thank you for joining us, and make it a great day. Bye-bye.